It's not a goal to negotiate with Hamas for any kind of ceasefire. And it's not a goal to bring them back in any other way other than to rescue them along the way.
From the Times, this is The World in 10. Today, joined by Gabrielle Weiniger, the Times correspondent in Israel. And we're talking about Israel's newly approved plan for Gaza. Gabby, this seems to go well beyond Netanyahu's earlier war goals to get rid of Hamas and recover those hostages. What does this new plan involve?
I think Netanyahu still firmly believes that this is the way to get rid of Hamas, and the more hawkish elements in his government have been calling for this really all along. I think what's changed, firstly, is for the Gazan population, it's really unclear what's going to happen to the civilians who are being told they're going to be moved out for their own protection. Where are they going to go? They're going to be moved from the north to the south. We've seen already Israel enact certain operations to clear out the southern city of Rafah. It's been completely flattened. Some 70% of Gaza is now in control of Israel. This is something that's been happening over the past 2 months since the resumption of fighting in mid-March and since the breakdown of the 6-week ceasefire. Hamas now saying they're not willing to go back to negotiations. It's really given Israel somewhat of a free rein to do what they set out to do, to destroy Hamas. But what's changed for families of the hostages is now the hostages are barely even a priority. They seem more like a tangential war goal than something that is a priority for them. They're saying that this new strategy to essentially occupy all of Gaza will see them rescue hostages possibly along the way. That is a quote, along the way. It's not a goal anymore. It's not a goal to negotiate them back in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. It's not a goal to negotiate with Hamas for any kind of ceasefire. And it's not a goal to bring them back in any other way other than to rescue them along the way. And I think that's a huge change also for the Israeli public to swallow.
To take and to occupy indefinitely somewhere that Israel pulled out from years ago seems a big step. What's been the international reaction?
There's been a huge backlash, of course, particularly from aid groups who are saying that Israel's new plan, which is essentially to outsource the distribution of vital humanitarian aid, which we remember hasn't gone into Gaza since March, despite things starting to move in January during the ceasefire. In March, there was a complete standstill, even before the fighting resumed. So we saw the blockade of goods, fuel, vital medicine, food and clean water, electricity, completely stop on March the 2nd. And that has led the population to be in dire straits, to say the least. They're quite desperate. We've even heard murmurings from the US administration, Donald Trump, saying he will help get food into Gaza. But that, within the Israeli cabinet, those hardline ministers that we mentioned earlier, they are completely against any kind of humanitarian aid going into Gaza. And the new Israeli plan won't see soldiers distribute aid. It will see them outsource the distribution of aid, not to the banned UNRWA, who are the UN body in charge of Palestinian affairs in Gaza and elsewhere, and not to the World Food Programme and not to those donor countries or donor organizations, rather to private security companies, similar to what we see in the West Bank, where private security guards man these checkpoints and stop Israeli soldiers coming face to face with desperate civilians, really, kind of putting a barrier there, protecting the soldiers and removing any interaction between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian civilians. And what we've seen in the West Bank is security guards acting on their own accord. Okay, it's overseen by the Israeli government, it's overseen by the Israeli military, rather, but there's not any accountability on those checkpoints. And we're going to see a similar thing in Gaza, where Israel has already set up several man-made checkpoints across the Strip, in particular in the middle of the Strip, in the Netzarim corridor, which separates the north and the south of Gaza, and the Morag corridor, which is also a man-made buffer zone that was created over the last few months, which completely cuts off the southern city of Rafah. And Rafah is a good example of what we're going to see if this plan is enacted over the coming weeks. Of course, there has been a window of opportunity offered by Netanyahu to Donald Trump is a goodwill gesture, perhaps, to say there is this week before Trump visits the region where we might see some kind of breakthrough in negotiations.
Does this mean Donald Trump is now the one man who could prevent this escalation?
It's possible. I think Donald Trump has erred on and off in his interest in the Gaza ceasefire. At the very beginning of his term, he said this is something he's going to solve. He pitched an outlandish plan to solve it, which was widely rejected, to take over the Gaza Strip by America. And we've seen him kind of go back and forth on this. The murmurings of offering to help feed Gazans is a positive step, but he hasn't really shown any forceful effort to push Netanyahu to do so, to bring in that international aid, as we saw Joe Biden do when aid was blocked, as we saw the international community do when aid was blocked. We haven't seen that kind of forceful push from Donald Trump to get aid in. It's not really clear. He really has seemed to have given Netanyahu a free rein to do what he wants. And I think Netanyahu has taken that as a green light, and also seen that Donald Trump perhaps isn't as hawkish as he expected him to be, particularly on issues like Iran and firing Mike Waltz, who was more hawkish on some kind of a strike, a US-Israel strike on Iran. So Netanyahu might be kind of taking advantage of that silence, or taking advantage of that lack of interest, or dipping in and out of the conflict, dipping in and out of solving the conflict, to do what he wishes and what his cabinet is pushing for, which is the reoccupation of Gaza by the military. And of course, there are elements in his government who also seek for the resettlement of Jewish civilians in the Gaza Strip as well.
As far as being announced, the Trump visit will take in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, but it seems not Israel. Is there a danger this is about optics, the optics of Netanyahu starting a big operation while Trump is in the neighborhood?
I think that's why he's going to wait until, and he's given that kind of golden window of opportunity for something to flourish before that, and before this so-called operation, or I think it's called Gideon, Chariot of Gideon. Before that operation starts, he's given that time. He's called up the reservists, but they haven't gone in yet. Tens of thousands of reservists are getting letters as we speak, but they haven't gone up yet. So this operation hasn't started, and he's giving this a moment to say there is a chance of diplomacy, perhaps on the back of the idea that Donald Trump is looking to push forward on the Abraham Accords, the continuation of normalization between Israel and formerly hostile countries, particularly Saudi Arabia. So that could be a window of opportunity there to make something happen and negotiate the release of hostages, and perhaps pull back from the brink of this all-out reoccupation. That being said, I don't think it's particularly likely, especially given that Hamas are now saying Israel is starving Gazan civilians, and they are not willing to continue negotiations in Qatar or in Egypt in any way to make a ceasefire deal. They're just not interested.
You touched on Operation Gideon Chariots, outsourcing of aid by Israel, trying to feed Gazans in some way. What do the aid agencies and the UN, who at least until very recently have been feeding people in Gaza, what's been their take on this plan?
They flatly rejected it. They are unlikely to even help with the future of distributing aid. That they're not even in the Israeli plan to distribute aid, and they are warning that Gaza's already run out of aid. Israel is saying there's still 3 or 4 weeks left. There's still 3 or 4 weeks left of goods and food until they've fully run out, and they really do have to do something after that point. But the UN is saying we're already at breaking point. The bakeries are already shut. There is no food. There is no there are no supplies in their warehouses. And of course, we have to remember as well the danger to UN workers and civil defense workers and aid workers and medics who are operating in this war-torn place, which we've seen before that they're not safe. It's very hard to coordinate with the Israeli military in their operations as they try and take down Hamas. And this is a very dangerous area to operate in. So we have this double-edged sword of the ongoing war and a complete lack of resources and supplies.
The cabinet approved this plan, on the same day a Houthi missile came down at Israel's main airport. That's prompted Israel to join the US and even Britain in attacking Yemen. How serious is the threat from the Houthis?
I think Israel's treating the threat from the Houthis as a threat from their enemies as a whole. That means they are holding Iran responsible for anything that the Houthis do. They firmly believe that Iran are the ones who are funding the Houthis, are supplying the weaponries. And that is why yesterday we saw a major hit on the Hodeidah port in Western Yemen on the Red Sea. We have sources in Israel telling us that port was completely wiped out. If that port has indeed been destroyed, it means that the Houthis won't be getting the supplies from Iran. And that's what Israel's looking to do, really, to stop that oxygen line, to cut them off from Iran, and to hold Iran responsible for any action they're taking. I think it was a shock, definitely, to the Israeli public that the Houthis managed to get so close to their target. They have threatened the airport before, but there's only really been one other time where they had a direct hit in central Israel, and that was at the very beginning of the Houthi attacks. Last July it was, in 2024, where they killed a man in his apartment in Tel Aviv. The sirens didn't even go off. So this was a mistake. But they allowed this, or they were unable to stop the ballistic missile from hitting its target. Then again, Israel has said that they don't have a hermetic system, missile defense system. It managed to penetrate. They said that 95% of Houthi missiles are taken down. And we have seen over the past 2 weeks, almost daily missiles coming in, and Israelis aren't going to their shelters. They aren't hearing the sirens. And so this was really quite a one-off. And I think that the public is certainly treating it that way. And Israel are trying to cut off the head of the snake, as they call it, and to stop Iran from supplying the Houthis with any more ballistic missiles or fuel to continue to attack Israel.
Beyond Yemen and the Houthis, Israel's also been hitting Syria and Lebanon. Are these disparate actions, or is there again a common thread between them?
That's again the common thread, is this idea of treating the region as a whole and not as one enemy in Hamas or one enemy in Hezbollah. The idea is that Iran is behind all of these, and these are all proxies. This is Hezbollah in Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. It is preventing the Iranian takeover of Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Israel now has a strategy of allying with minority communities, including the Druze, potentially the Kurds in Syria, in order to stop Iran from allying with the Sunni government or the Alawi, or just to stop their infiltration in Syria completely. That is their aim. So I think it's really a wider picture of what they're doing in Lebanon and what they're doing in Syria. And they're holding on to vital positions in southern Lebanon. They're holding on to vital positions in southern Syria in order to preemptively stop anything like what happened on October the 7th happening again on their borders. And I think that's the policy now, to treat everything as a whole rather than to try and fight on individual fronts.
If we look ahead, are we getting more of a sense now as to what Gaza will look like and what Israel will look like if this war ever ends?
I think we've had a sense of what Gaza will look like, and it will only get worse from here. If Israel's holding 70% of water on Gaza, 90% of the buildings are fully or partially destroyed. The population's been squeezed into islands of so-called safety, but we've heard that nowhere is really safe in Gaza. The international press haven't been there. There's complete reliance on courageous Palestinian journalists to get the news out. But what we've seen of hungry civilians, of lawlessness and chaos, of the military acting almost with impunity and going ahead with what they need to do to crush Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian population, the situation there, it's unimaginable, and we can't imagine it because we haven't seen it ourselves. We've only seen it in those images. I think also the Israeli public are exhausted. The reservists that have been called up, many of them are saying they're not going to go ahead. They don't necessarily cite ideological reasons as to why they're not going to fight. They cite perhaps burnout or an inability to leave their families or their work because they've already served 200, 300 days. So what's actually happening with that large call up is that Israel is going to send its conscripts into Gaza and then send those reservists into other places, like you mentioned, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the West Bank, to do that work so they can rotate them more and not give them that very difficult job of being a soldier in Gaza. So the public in Israel is exhausted. The public in Palestine, in Gaza, are exhausted, hungry, war-torn, homeless. It's very hard to see a chink of light in that picture.
Times correspondent Gabrielle Weiniger, thank you so much for your time today.